Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm your host, Jeffrey, and subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. Now, on Saturday, there's a game between the BYU Cougars traveling on the road at the Stanford Cardinal. Who do I think is going to win this game? Let's break it down. Now, BYU is 6-5 to start the season, and they're an independent school, so no conference record. And Kalani Sitake's done a really good job, BYU, over his 7-year tenure. But they have struggled a bit this season, but they're still having a decent season. They won at South Florida 50-21 in week 1. That was a good win. Then they beat Baylor 26-20 in overtime at home. That was a good win. That was one of their better performances of the season. Then they lost at Oregon 41-20. That was a tough loss. Oregon's having a great season in the Pac-12. Then they beat Wyoming 38-24, and that was a good win. Then they beat Utah State 38-26, but then they lost against Notre Dame in Las Vegas 28-20. That was a tough loss. Then they lost to Arkansas 52-35, and then they lost at Liberty 41-14. And that was their low point of the season. Even though it was at Liberty, that was a terrible result for BYU, and they had lost 3 in a row. Then they lost to East Carolina at home 27-24, but they have since turned it around and won at Boise State 31-28, and then they beat Utah Tech 52-26. So better results there. And in that Utah Tech game, quarterback Jaren Hall had 456 yards, 5 touchdowns, and interception. He's a solid quarterback. Obviously, those numbers are inflated because he was playing against Utah Tech, an FCS school. But Jaren Hall, he's not Zach Wilson, but he has played well for BYU. And when he has played well, BYU's been a really good team this year, but he has not been super consistent, but he can play. He's a really good quarterback. Running back Christopher Brooks at 102 yards and wide receiver Keanu Hill at 137 yards and 3 touchdowns. Both are really solid players for BYU on offense. And on the defensive side of the ball, linebacker Keenan Pili had 5 tackles, defensive lineman Tyler Batty had 3 tackles, and defensive lineman John Nelson had 2 tackles for BYU against Utah Tech. And BYU's defense has been solid at times this season, but they've also had a few games where they've been downright poor, and their offense has been the same way. They've just been a really inconsistent team this season, but when they are clicking on both sides of the ball, BYU is still a really solid team. Now on the Stanford side, they're 3-8 and 1-8 in the Pac-12 to start the season, and David Shaw, one of the most respected coaches in college football, has really fallen back down to earth. Stanford is really struggling the last few years, and they're really struggling this season, and there's just no end in sight right now to their struggles, and they've not had a really good season this year. And in week 1, they did beat Colgate 41-10, and that was a good win. But then they lost to USC 41-28. They lost at Washington 40-22, and they lost at Oregon 45-27. They were not competitive in any of 3 of these games, and obviously they did try, but those teams are just way better than Stanford right now. Then they lost to Oregon State 28-27. They were competitive, they just could not get the win. Then they beat Notre Dame on the road 16-14, and that was the high mark of their season. But Notre Dame was playing a lot worse then, and they're playing a lot better now. Then they beat Arizona State 15-14. And that was a good win, but they have not won since. They lost at UCLA 38-13. They lost to Washington State 52-14. They lost at Utah 42-7, and then they lost at California the 40th anniversary of the play 27-20. And the problem for Stanford is they just have not been competitive toward the end of the season. They're getting blown out in a lot of these games. At least at the beginning of the season, they had a lot more fight, but it just seems like the team is, not saying it's given up on David Shaw, but they're just really struggling right now. And quarterback Tanner McKee had 271 yards, a touchdown, and an interception in the California game. And he's a solid quarterback, and he does have an NFL potential future because of the fact of his size, and he can make a lot of throws. But he's on the wrong team. Stanford's offensive line is not what it used to be when Christian McCaffrey and Bryce Love were in the backfield. And that is really hurting Tanner McKee because he is a pocket passer, and he has not a lot of mobility. And that is really hurting the Stanford offense. Running back Mitch Lieber had 83 yards and a touchdown, and wide receiver Elijah Higgins had 69 yards and a touchdown. Stanford has decent offensive players, but their offense is really struggling this season. A lot of it has to do with the poor offensive line. And on the defensive side of the ball, safety Alakai Gilman had 4 tackles and interception, linebacker Ricky Meason had 3 tackles, and cornerback Ethan Bonner had 3 tackles for Stanford against California. And Stanford has some talented players still left on their team. They have some decent defensive players and some decent offensive players, but they're just really struggling on both sides of the ball. And they have really struggled as the season's gone on to even stay competitive in games, and it just doesn't seem like Stanford's giving it 110%. I'm not doubting that David Shaw is getting his team ready to go out in the field, but they're just really struggling right now, and Stanford's going to have to get some more talent on the program again if they're going to start to be a better Pac-12 program again. And so David Shaw will be able to continue to be the Stanford head coach and maybe not get fired in the future if he's not able to turn Stanford around. So who do I think is going to win this game? BYU is the more talented team here. A few years ago, that would have been insane to say that. Stanford would have been way more talented than BYU, but BYU is more talented than Stanford. BYU's played better this season. They're 6-5, and Stanford's 3-8. And I'm not a records guy. Your record is not the be-all and end-all because upsets happen all the time. And Stanford could win this game. Stanford, if they show up to play, they still have enough good players to get this done. They can get this win. It is at home, and Stanford usually is better at home, but they haven't really been that good at home this season. But BYU has more talent. Kalani Sitake still has his team playing for something. They're playing for a bowl. Stanford cannot make a bowl game, and I think that's going to be a big difference here. I got BYU beating Stanford 31-24. I think Stanford can win this game. Again, the home field advantage is going to help. I still think David Shaw is a great coach, and I think he's going to get his team ready to play, but I don't know if Stanford is going to be able to play well enough, especially the way they've been playing lately, and the amount of holes that they have on their team to be able to beat a BYU team that is really talented. Kalani Sitake has them playing decent football, and even though they had a rough stretch in the middle of the season, BYU is starting to play better football right now, and I think that is going to carry over in the last game of the season. And I think BYU is going to beat Stanford 31-24. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below whether you think BYU or Stanford is going to win this game and why, and I will see you next time.